Welcome, everybody. We are here with another virtual talk that goes along with our Snoopy Soars with NASA exhibit, and I will let Mary Lyle introduce our speaker for today.
Hi, everyone. I am so excited to be introducing our guest, Dave Dooling. He's the Education Director for the New Mexico Museum of Space History in Alamogordo, New Mexico. And from testing rockets that took the astronauts to the surface of the moon and back to knowing which rocks to collect, New Mexico played a vital role in the Apollo project. So we're going to let Dave give us his presentation right now. And it puts New Mexico right in the center of the Apollo program. So Dave.
Okay, good afternoon, or good evening rather. Thank you for inviting me to join everybody virtually. It's great to be with you. Going to talk, actually hop over several different aspects of how New Mexico, or the road to the moon, ran through New Mexico. So if I can take over now and share screen. And let's see if I can. Okay, there we go. So this is the start of construction on White Sands Test Facility in the early 1960s. They have somewhat better signs there now than this early one. But if you've been out in the area, you'll probably recognize this is Highway 70 coming right through the San Augustine Pass behind the sign. So July 16, 1969, I was there. It took me a long time to locate this picture. I actually stumbled across it when I was digging up photographs for this presentation. But that's me as a summer hire security guard. I was a college student, so I had the privilege of working there June, July, August, and got to see the launch from the press site. So take note of the distance. It's from here. This is the Mosquito Lagoon. It is well named. Out to there, I got to be all over the place. I was at the launch pad at T-minus 1 week. I was in the vehicle assembly building, launch control, the clean room, out in the swamps with mosquitoes who love me a lot. All 1 million of them love me. I must have been their type. Okay, so that launch leads to this, Apollo 11 on the surface of the moon, July 20, 1969. And basically a crew of 400,000 people, Americans plus millions of taxpayers, because it was our space program, who made it all happen. New Mexico's part was with some small components that were extremely important because we wouldn't have been able to get there and back without them. So I'll be talking about these rocket engines, this one here, which is partly obscured by that shield, and then this one, and then more on the command service module that helped make it happen. So here's Apollo 11 just starting to leave Earth, and we're going to be talking about testing the Apollo spacecraft stack, 50 rocket engines and motors. And the difference in the wording there is if it has moving parts, it's an engine. That's usually liquid rocket engines. If it's a solid, we call it a motor. But basically, you're burning stuff in a small container to make hot gas go out really fast in one direction, so your rocket goes in the other direction. So to do that testing, NASA needed a secure remote facility. And this led to the creation of what is now White Sands Test Facility, just north of Highway 70. You come down the San Augustine Pass or head up that direction on Highway 70, and you see a sign, NASA Johnson Space Center, White Sands Test Facility this way. And don't bother taking the road because they're not going to let you in. Okay, they have very tight security around it, and for good reason, because they're doing testing there. Hazardous materials, sometimes working with national security equipment. They've done a lot of testing for the Air Force and others up there. In test stands like this, those are steam generators. And I'll talk a little bit about how those are used to simulate space, and in various other facilities. Come through the gate, main test area, engine test stands, lots of interesting stuff going on. So the first, what led to it was small engine testing. So I mentioned that we've got 50 different rocket engines and motors that need to be tested. And it's because they use a unique fuel and oxidizer. There's very definite yin and yang to it. So this monomethyl hydrazine, basically it's nitrogen holding on to hydrogen and carbon. What's neat about it, and the oxidizer, nitrogen holding on to oxygen, what's neat about these two is that you can store them without any special refrigeration or heating, store them for long periods of time. They're stable on their own. They don't break down easily. And when they come into contact with each other, they ignite. You can just pump them for small rocket engines. You can use gas pressure on a bladder to squeeze them into the rocket engine, open the valve, rockets working, close the valve, rockets off. No spark plug. That's the yin. The yang part of it, it's toxic as heck. So that summer that I'm working as a security guard, part of my training was, if you smell something like ammonia, it's hydrazine. If you smell something fishy, it's nitrogen tetroxide. Don't worry about remembering which is which, because you're going to die anyway. So where are you going to test stuff like that? Way the heck out in the desert. So going back to the Apollo stack, after launch, spacecraft is stored like this. Is an old National Geographic drawing. Launch escape tower is jettisoned, spacecraft turns around, and you're coasting to the moon like this. So we've got engine, service module engine here, attitude control here, more attitude control, more here, ascent engine, descent engine. You come out to visit us at the museum. We have a boilerplate mock-up of the command module. We also have an outreach and education mock-up of the Mercury spacecraft. So that gives you an idea of how big the rest of this is. For example, the Mercury spacecraft could easily fit inside that engine bell. Okay, so on the lunar module, here she is. You're used to seeing it with all the beautiful gold foil and aluminum siding attached to it. This was a very fragile birdcage-like structure. So this is called a quad thruster. And here, this shows we have two of those engines. They're called R4Ds. They produce 100 pounds of thrust. The valves are here, the plumbing line's here. And then deep inside it, this stage is the ascent stage. The crew road inside is the ascent engine that would get them from the lunar surface back up into lunar orbit. Fuel tank, oxidizer tank over here, and it was offset a little bit because this one weighed more. So like a teeter-totter with a big kid on one side and a little kid on the other, you balance it by moving the little kid farther out, and you can get it to sit nice and level. So here's the test article, one of the test articles they used at White Sands Test Facility. The picture on the left, it's out for display at an Apollo anniversary event in Las Cruces. The image on the right, that's me standing inside of it, inside the crew module, with absolutely none of the crew equipment in, because that's not what it was used for. This was a plumbing test article, because it's not enough to say that the engines work. The plumbing, everything going from the fuel and oxidizer tanks here has to work through the valves, valves leaving the tank, pre-valves, and then the quad thruster here, another one here, another pair on the opposite side. Pressurized nitrogen and helium to squeeze that stuff out so it goes where it has to. You turn on the engine, pressure changes inside. You shut off the engine, the pressure changes again. You've experienced the same thing at home. You're running the faucet full on in the bathroom sink or the kitchen sink, and you slap it off real fast and you hear a slight water hammer effect. Same thing happens with rockets, and the last thing you want is that water hammer popping some of this plumbing loose while you're in space. That would be a very bad day. So the testing, as I said, was a lot more than just will the engines work or not. It included making sure the entire plumbing system, the electronics on the valves, that it endures the vacuum of space. Because one of the things that can happen as you go into the vacuum of space, you have just a little bit of air pressure left inside. You can wind up with electrical arcing. and you short everything out. We've lost satellites that way. So you want to make sure that none of that happens. Okay, now this is not the test article that they had. They had a descent stage test article as well. So it was basically these box-like structures plus all the plumbing, all the plumbing and the descent engine. So the struts here for the landing gear were not included. I don't have a good photograph at hand. So this is the descent stage, and this was brought, plumbing test model basically of this was brought to White Sands as well. Service module, it had those R4D thrusters that I talked about. Again, we've got a pair of these on display at the museum. There were 16 around the lunar module and 16 around the service module. And you could fire them in different combinations so that you could roll the spacecraft in any direction, or you could push it forward, sideways, up, down, so that you could rendezvous and dock with the Apollo lunar module, first to pull it out of the third stage on your way to the moon, and then to retrieve the crew and the rock samples as they come back up from the lunar surface. This open area, by the way, is deliberate. They had cameras and other equipment in there to do some high resolution mapping of the moon. And then on the way home, when the astronauts had to do what was called the deepest EVA to come out and retrieve those film modules. Then inside the command module were 12 thrusters like this. They produced as much thrust as this, but they had the added trick that they had to be buried inside the surface. They couldn't stick out the way these did. So these only operated in the vacuum of space. These only operated during reentry, during that fireball when the crew is coming back to Earth. So they had to be hidden inside the surface. So these just pointed straight out. These pointed out at an angle. So you wind up having to cut the nozzle at an angle like that. So again, testing the command module and the service module is part of what was done at White Sands. And here is one of the service module engines. This is a service module engine, not at White Sands, but being tested at an Air Force facility in Tennessee. So you can see how large that engine is. So we have one of these on display at the museum as well. Okay, next one. Okay, here we've got command service module being set up. This is just the service module right now, and then the command module will be added, and then the nozzle extension added for vacuum testing. Cameras inside armored boxes, crews testing everything to make sure that you don't have any leaks, because shortly they will be hooking up the ground tanks of hydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide to fill up the tanks here and run the tests. So here's a comparison of those three engines. Service module engine and the lunar ascent engine had to work first time every time. And they were strictly on off. It was either full thrust or zero thrust, but they had to work every time, because if this doesn't work, you don't slow to go into orbit around the moon, or you don't speed up to leave lunar orbit and to go home. And if you saw the movie Apollo 13, and they wanted to use this engine to do a U-turn in deep space and get the crew back to Earth faster, but then they were worried, what if the explosion damaged this engine? If we fire this engine up, it ruptures and we lose everything. So they didn't use it. The ascent engine, little tiny thing, and this part of it actually stuck up inside the crew cabin. So when the astronaut, so you see a good comparison here with an engineer, one of the astronauts, when they were sleeping on the lunar surface, would actually have to sleep with his butt sitting on top of the cover for this engine, and kind of in a semi-crouch position in 16G. The lunar module descent engine had let me back up here, had a different challenge. It had to be throttleable. It had to go from 100% thrust down to 10% thrust. And that was a real challenge, because we'd never done that with a rocket engine before. You could play with the valves a little bit to make sure that you're mixing the fuel and oxidizer just right, kind of like playing with getting warm water instead of full hot or full cold. You want the water just warm enough, so you're going to shave, or you want to wash dishes without blistering your hands. This had to go all the way down to 10%, because as you're getting closer to the lunar surface, you're burning off fuel and oxidizer. Your spacecraft is getting lighter, so you have to pull the thrust back, so you keep falling slowly. slowly to the lunar surface and not crashing into it. And when you heard on the Apollo 11 air-to-ground transmissions, when you hear mission control say 30 seconds, he's not saying that you're 30 seconds away from the surface. He's saying you've got 30 seconds of fuel left, which really means you've got 20 seconds to be on the surface, because if you have to abort, if you have to punch out and go back to lunar orbit, you need about 5-10 seconds of a stable platform to switch over to abort mode and then bug out. So how on Earth do you simulate a rocket engine being in space? You use lots and lots of steam. So this is test stance Rio 2. The diagrams for 401 is slightly different, but they use basically the same principle. You got 4 steam generators. So you put the engine that you're testing, or maybe even the entire spacecraft that you're testing with the engine attached, inside a vacuum chamber. Okay, you fire the rocket engine inside a vacuum chamber. Pretty soon, it's not a vacuum anymore. You're full of exhaust gas. Where is it going to go? You vent it outside. So it comes through a couple of venturis, and you have high pressure steam being generated and helping push the exhaust out and making sure that atmospheric pressure can't back up and refill the chamber. That way you've got a vacuum around this engine and you're simulating space. And this is important because this nozzle is pretty fragile if you're going to use it down on Earth in an atmosphere. You watch videos of a shuttle launch, and the last few seconds before T0, they'll go to a close-up of the rocket engines, the main engines firing up, and you'll see the lip of the expansion bell wiggle back and forth, stretch back and forth, just kind of like taking a solo cup lip or styrofoam coffee cup and flexing it back and forth. That's the outside air pressure pushing back, because you've got lower than atmospheric pressure inside the engine. So if you tested this thing at sea level or mountain level pressure, it's probably going to crack because it's going to be too much. The pressure inside is not going to be enough. So the steam basically helps suck the exhaust out and keep the atmosphere from backing into it. So every single one of the test stands has a rig similar to that. Some of the engine tests were done at atmospheric level pressure. For example, all the engines, the small engines on Space Shuttle, were tested over and over and over again out at WSTF. And some of those tests were done without using the vacuum setup. Okay, so one of the things that you might hear from people is the claim that, oh, the moon landings are fake, because when we got that video of the last one lifting off from the surface of the moon, there's no rocket exhaust. You don't have a bright yellow flame stick coming out. That means it's a fraud, right? Wrong. It just means that the rocket exhaust is invisible, because stepping over to a completely different rocket, the Gemini rocket that launched the 2-man spacecraft, you can see the exhaust coming out of this is burning basically the same fuel and oxidizer as here. That's almost invisible. The only reason you're seeing anything here is where the shock wave is forming from 2 different exhaust plumes mixing with each other and then mixing with the atmosphere. And a lot of people will tell you, well, rockets can't work in space because there's no air to push against. Actually, it's the other way around. They work better in space because if you're in the atmosphere, you've got that back pressure from the atmosphere. So rockets actually become more efficient as you go up in altitude, and they work best in a vacuum without any back pressure. So yes, this is real. There's hot rocket exhaust. The first frame from this video, you can see aluminum foil being blown all over the place as this thing takes off. And actually the back panels here get buckled from some of the exhaust backing up inside. So rockets actually work better in space. Now, another area that White Sands Test Facility made a difference was in crew safety assurance, mission assurance, following the Apollo 1 fire. Gus Grissom, Ed White, Roger Chaffee were supposed to fly the first manned Apollo mission. And a couple of weeks before that launch, they were killed in a fire on the launch pad. tragedy that shook the nation and shook NASA even more because there was a lot of flammable material inside. The air pressure inside the spacecraft was 16 pounds per square inch, slightly higher than sea level, 16 psi, pure oxygen, because they're going to be breathing pure oxygen during the ascent. And one way of checking for leaks is to overpressurize it, breathe pure oxygen until they got into orbit. And then after that, they, as they get go up in altitude, they will gradually vent down to 4.5 psi pure oxygen, because that's basically what we're breathing. Most of what you're breathing is nitrogen. The oxygen is just about 1/3 of the atmosphere, but you decompress to that level and you get the bends. So they're breathing pure oxygen, which saturates stuff, paper, Velcro, the nylon, and spacesuits. Lots of materials caught fire. So, and unfortunately, I don't have a picture of the test facilities, but this was added to White Sands Test Facilities charter, was to test anything that goes into the spacecraft, anything non-metal, and actually even some metals would burn quite well, and find out what its burn characteristics are. You're going to put something in the cabin, you test it, you prove to me that you're not adding a hazard, that you're not endangering the crew by doing this. So that testing goes on at WSTF. It also goes on at Marshall Space Flight Center. And it's very careful, methodical testing. I help rewrite some of the test manuals for Marshall. Very careful, methodical stuff, because, as I said, they want to make sure if anything goes in there, because they love Velcro. The astronauts love Velcro. Ground crews hate it because when you get back, you got to strip it off. And gray tape as well. So launch abort testing. Now, this was not done at White Sands Test Facility. This was done at White Sands Missile Range. So the map here shows the Range Museum, which is temporarily closed. But it's the same location. And here's an example of spacecraft being prepared for a launch abort test. And this hangar is still used to prepare sounding rockets. So I was mentioning the Solar Dynamics Observatory sends data down. Periodically, NASA will launch a sounding rocket with copies of the instruments on SDO to do a comparison, because staring at the sun 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for years is really, really brutal. So here they're prepping it, full, active, flight-ready launch escape system, and there are 3 rockets involved in this. The main escape motor, a pitch motor, and then a jettison motor up here. So that completes our 50 rockets. Now, this is not a full flight capsule. This is what is known as boilerplate, which is a great all-purpose description that can mean pretty much whatever you want. And it goes back to the very first Mercury spacecraft that NASA built. They didn't really build them. NASA did not have a contractor yet. They had the design. They didn't have a contractor to build the flight vehicles, but they wanted to start testing. So the Space Task Group, rather, went across. It was at Langley Research Center in Hampton. They went across the river to Norfolk Shipbuilding and Dry Dock, and they had the first Mercury mock-ups built in the same factory that built boilers for the U.S. Navy warships in World War II. Hence the term boilerplate, which sounds like really sloppy work, but it's really precision. You think about the pressures, the demands on a boiler, especially for a warship, that's precision work. So a boilerplate is going to be something that has the same weight, shape, center of mass, etc., as a flight vehicle. And some of the hardware on it is going to be flight qualified, like where they're going to attach the escape tower to the capsule. That's flight hardware. And most important, the guidance system, the abort sensor system for the Apollo spacecraft in here is flight hardware, and the parachutes, the recovery system, are flight hardware. The rest of it, not so much. So this is how it was tested. Little Joe 2 launch vehicle. If any of you have been to the casinos, a little Joe means a pair of 2s showing up on the dice. So the original Little Joe 2 had 4 solid rocket motors in it to test the escape system for Mercury. Manager walks by, takes a look at the drawing on an engineer's desk and says, wow, that looks like a Little Joe, and the name stuck. So Little Joe 2 was bigger, more rocket engines for testing the Apollo spacecraft. And basically what it would do is get the spacecraft, the command module, and the escape tower to the right altitude and speed where you might expect something to go wrong. during a launch. And then you send a command telling it that something's gone wrong and activate the abort system. So the escape tower pulls the spacecraft away, separates, drogue parachute pops out, slows the spacecraft, gets it oriented, then the main chutes come out and they gradually deploy. And there's a real art to disreefing parachutes bit by bit so that you gently slow the spacecraft. You don't want to pop them out right away. You probably break the astronauts' backs, and that doesn't matter because you're going to shred the parachutes and everything becomes a disaster. So it's a real art. You ever watch parachutes disreefing? They do it slowly. It is an incredible exercise in energy management. And then the command module impacts in the water. Okay, here it's going to be the hard soil or hard sand at White Sands missile range. But actually, the interior was set up so that it would handle coming down on land if that was the case. So this is a pad abort test. What happens if you have to just take off right from the launch pad? And go back to that photograph of me at the launch, and ask you to take note of how far away it was. The Saturn V rocket weighed about, take away the spacecraft, we're talking about 4.8 million pounds, 4.5 million pounds of liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen, and a type of kerosene. All sitting there stored, getting ready to send you to the moon. But if something on the rocket breaks, then it's free to do whatever the heck it wants. And NASA calculated that the safest distance you could be from an on-the-pad explosion was 3 miles. So they put the press site at 3.1 miles, along with the assembly building, launch control center, et cetera. But that means if you're sitting on top of that stack, you want to get out of Dodge real fast. So you have the rocket with 4 exhaust ports just barely blazing away from the space capsule, pulling you away at high speed. And then this little pitch motor is going to tilt you over so that it takes you out over the ocean, takes you about 4 or 5 miles out into the Atlantic for a parachute landing, where Air Force rescue crews, parajumpers, would come in and pull you out and helicopter you back to land. So here's a couple of higher altitude launches, one kind of grainy, one slightly better, but you can see they had different combinations of solid rocket motors in there, depending on how high they were going to go, how fast they wanted the rocket going. For example, you will hear even during launches now, max Q, maximum dynamic pressure. So as you're going faster and faster, the air is resisting you more and more, but at the same time, the air is getting thinner. So max Q is sort of a crossover point where your speed is increasing, but the air is getting thin enough that now the pressure is going to drop. So max Q is an important point to test these things. Now, here's a great example of how well that launch abort system worked. This is the last of 5 Little Joe 2 tests that they did at White Sands Missile Range. One of the steering vanes on the rocket locked over in position and started spinning it faster and faster until finally the rocket tore itself apart. The launch abort system immediately detected something was wrong. Here's the pitch motor firing up, and at the same instant, the escape tower motor is firing up and then pulls the capsule away from the rocket as it explodes. So it was good design. And the end of each one, you've got the capsule on the ground, crew shaken but not stirred on the inside. So those are the 2 big things that went on. White Sands test facility on the east side of the mountains, San Augustine Mountains, and forgive me, I am blanking. I am bit flipping. This is why I became a writer instead of an engineer. Bit flipping on the name of the mountain range. On the east side, White Sands Test Facility on the east side, west side of the range, and White Sands Missile Range on the east side, both playing important roles in testing the smaller engines that would be used on the Apollo program. And then astronaut training. So this is when the astronauts came here, because New Mexico is this wonderful geological treasure trove. So they tested in 6 different locations here, also Arizona, Idaho, Washington State, Oregon, down in Mexico, Hawaii. Here they are learning geology from the U.S. Geological Survey, which now has a large astrogeology division at Philmont Ranch, the Boy Scout ranch in the northern part of the state. Valley Caldera in the Jemez Mountains, Zuni Lake, Kilbourne Hole, volcanic crater to the west of Las Cruces. The Capulan Volcanics didn't get a picture of that, but here they are at the Rio Grande Gorge outside Taos, because this has a lot of good geological strata exposed, similar to some of the rills, the highland areas and valleys that they were planning on exploring in the later missions. This is a nice little, almost a nice little off-road model of the lunar rover vehicle that was carried on the last 3 missions. And yes, they actually carried these around because they needed the astronauts to get used to carrying this weight on their back and throwing their center of mass off. And because they're going to go over and they're going to bend over and pick up and collect rocks, take photographs. It's pre-digitals. This is all filmed. These are Hasselblad 70mm cameras. Sample bags on the sides of the life support packs. Have to bend over, scoop stuff, drop it into the bag he's holding, and he's probably going to put it into his pouch because you can't very easily reach around in a pressurized spacesuit. And then a gnomon with a color standard and a vertical reference in just about every photograph that they're going to take. That way they can do color correction when they get back to Earth. And finally, 2 New Mexicans went to the moon. Not quite finally, next to finally. Ed Mitchell, Apollo 14, he was born in Texas, and his family then, during the Depression, soon moved to Artesia, which he always considered to be his home. And then Jack Schmitt, only geologist to go to the moon. On Apollo 17, last man mission to the moon, Jack was born at a hospital in Santa Rita and grew up in Silver City. So you can imagine, you know, even though the pilots, the Right Stuff pilots on the earlier missions all get geology training, and most of them burrowed into it pretty well because they knew that bringing the right samples back was important. But here you are, you're the first geologist on another world. That's got to be a real rush. So where'd the moon rocks go? They went to Houston. So these are America's crown jewels. About 850 pounds of rock and soil in the Lunar Laboratory Facility at Johnson Space Center behind a vault door that was provided by the Federal Reserve. I kid you not. It takes 2 combinations to open it up, and no one person has both sets of numbers. But what happens if something just went terribly, terribly bad at Johnson Space Center? Would we lose the entire collection? No. 1/7, 14% of that collection is stored in a vault at White Sands Test Facility. Unfortunately, I was not able to get a picture of the interior of it, but it's going to look pretty much like this. It's going to be a small vault and a small laboratory room. So you can see where they've got everything bagged up and set up so that the samples are handled in boxes pressurized with nitrogen, so they're not exposed to oxygen. Excuse me a second, I'm going to turn on just a little bit of light here. So the rocks are not exposed to oxygen, which might contaminate your analysis. So come see us at the museum. We've got a little Joe 2 rocket on display outside the museum, a boilerplate Apollo command module, which was used in rescue training at Cape Canaveral. And then inside we have lunar module ascent engine, service propulsion system engine, the attitude control thrusters, and a moon rock on display, along with a number of other Apollo related items. So I will stop screen share. Oh, and if you've been there, been to our museum in the last 3 years, or it's been like 2 or 3 years since you've been to us, please come back because we have a lot of new exhibits that have just been installed in the last year or so during the shutdown. And we are reopened for business, and here we are. So ready for questions.
If anyone has any questions, there is a Q&A button in our Zoom, and on Facebook, we are also monitoring questions. We don't have any so far, but I love how you debunked some of the conspiracies of landing on the moon. Do you guys have to defend that a lot at the museum?
No, not too often. It usually doesn't happen. People come to us because they want to see artifacts. They want to see some of the bits and pieces that we have. And we don't have the big giant stuff like Smithsonian or U.S. Space and Rocket Center has. But we have a lot of the personal items, stuff that the crews worked with. Even some personal hygiene items, samples of those, unused, of course, because that's every fourth grade boy's favorite question. When they were in space, how did they? You're right. The large Apollo artifact that we do have is an F1 engine. A first stage engine for the Saturn V on display out in the rocket park. We'd like to get one of the J2 engines. We're working on that and some other artifacts.
Okay. So really, I mean, they would have found somewhere else, but without White Sands, we might not have gone to the moon because we had to test it. And
right, without that testing, and as I said, they wanted a spot that was remote, so that if you did have an accident at the test facilities, open air, sunlight, etc., those chemicals will start to break down. So we wanted to make sure that by the time anything got to anybody's backyard, it's non-existent, it's safe, etc. Of course, since then, Las Cruces is kind of growing towards WSTF, but they've got a boundary set up so that nothing's going to happen. They have I think it's like 9 or 10 sets of test stands there that have done testing for Apollo shuttle, doing testing now for Orion spacecraft, have done testing for the Air Force, a whole range of different engine sizes. And it's not strictly the hypergolic stuff I was talking about. They do I'm trying to remember, I believe methane, liquefied natural gas, and oxygen. Replacements for the hydrazines are called green fuels, not so much because it's going to be green in outer space, but because the production here on Earth will be more green. So I got a question here. Did the Apollo astronauts drink Tang on the mission? No. I believe it was just one mission that had Tang, and they hated it, and that was it. But Tang advertised the heck out of it. They had reconstituted orange juice. And one of the stories from Apollo 16 is that on earlier missions, one of the astronauts, I believe it was Jim Irwin on Apollo 15, experienced heart irregularities. And the flight surgeon said, we'd really like to have him in an ICU here on Earth, but he's breathing pure oxygen in 1.6 G, so really that's better what we can do for him. But they were working so hard, they lost a lot of electrolytes. It caused arrhythmias. So on Apollo 16, they had to drink orange juice. Laced with potassium. They'd already had orange juice bags that they would reconstitute in space. And one of the things a lot of people don't appreciate is that the spacecraft never carried enough water for the crew to drink. The water was a byproduct from generating electricity. So they had liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen tanks on board the spacecraft, feed those into the fuel cell, mix them just the right way, electric circuits, etc., and you produce electricity. You can do the reverse, get a 9-volt battery, put a couple of thumbtacks in the bottom of a little plastic cup, fill it with salt water, touch the battery to those thumbtacks, and they got to be bare metal batteries, and you get little streams of gas coming up off the contacts. You are electrolyzing the water, breaking it apart using electricity. The reverse works. Produce electricity, and you get water as a byproduct. So they would take that water, squirt it into the bag, reconstitute it, drink it. On Apollo 16, they added potassium to make sure that the astronauts didn't lose electrolyte. John Young didn't really like the taste of it, and it gave him gas, and he was complaining about it, using language that really only a Navy pilot might use. And they get word from mission control, guys, you got a hot mic. So basically, all this blue language is going out to the world.
Oh.
So no Tang. Tang just flew that one time. They didn't like it, and that was it. You're out of there.
That's all it takes is one time. Then
That's
it's
right.
That's it. That's it. Because the astronauts don't walk on water; they walk about that far above it. As far as most people are concerned in the program. And if they're not going to drink it, and in fairness, NASA has a food science laboratory where the astronauts and nutrition experts and doctors and engineers sit down and they work through you're going to be stuck in this aluminum can for the next 6 months. What do you want to eat? And they'll work up meals. They'll have taste testing because you lose part of your sense of taste in space. Yes, we lose most of it, and that's because of fluid shift. You look at it from a mechanical standpoint, a physical standpoint, your body is a fluid-filled bag, in my case, 6 feet tall. And the reason I don't explode and bleed out at the ankles or any of us is because those blood vessels are highly elastic. They squeeze back against gravity, pulling the fluid down. It works very nicely. You go into space, you no longer have the effects of gravity, but those blood vessels are still squeezing. Lots of fluid goes upstairs. Your head gets engorged. You feel like I have a head cold. You sound like I have a head cold. So what happens to your sense of taste when you have a head cold? It's gone. So they lose a lot of it, so that they have to work to make meals that the astronauts want to have and they eat on schedule, because otherwise they'll be like kids. I'm going to eat all the chocolate, and mom and dad are gone. I'm going to eat all the chocolate chip cookies and the cake first. And all that's gone. And now you got to eat the nutritious stuff. In the meantime, you've just thrown your diet out of whack. So they work very carefully on giving them stuff that will keep them healthy and that they want to eat.
That's good information. I was also interested in the Space Hall of Fame.
Mm-hmm.
As I was going through the names, I noticed there are a lot of New Mexicans represented there.
Yes.
And if you want to talk a little bit, or are there anybody that stands out in your mind?
One that stands out in my mind is one that unfortunately we've not inducted yet, and that was Robert Gilbert Moore, and he passed away a few months ago. Gil was also born in Santa Rita and raised in Silver City. Went to New Mexico State University, a physics student, and very quickly he winds up working on payloads for V2 rockets that the Von Braun rocket team is launching from White Sands Proving Ground. They come up from Fort Bliss and launch the rockets, and that gets Gil into the space program. He winds up working for Thiokol Corporation, which built the boosters for Space Shuttle. And he's very engaged in science education and outreach and everything, and been doing it off and on all through his career, because he knew that we needed more young people to get interested to keep the space program going. Gil is at an international aerospace conference, I believe in Vienna, in fall 1976. And John Yardley, who's in overall charge of Space Shuttle, and at this point, Space Shuttle is still almost 5 years away from first launch. John Yardley gets up and announces a new type of payload that they're going to fly in Space Shuttle. Because one of the things you have to do with any aircraft is, or ship, is you got to trim the boat. You got to have it ballasted. You don't want it tilting, rolling one way or the other. So put a little extra weight here, extra weight there. And usually that's done with lead blocks. And John thinks that's stupid. Spending rocket fuel to send lead weights to space. You know what? We could just make it cans with small science experiments on board. About the size of a sounding rocket, 19 inches in diameter, about 2 feet high, so it looks like an oversized trash can, and 200 pounds that you can put inside. Basically, whatever you want, you get an on-off switch, that's it. So he announces it at the conference, and Gil thinks, wow, what a great education tool. Goes back to his hotel room, calls his wife in Utah, and they discuss it. And NASA is going to offer this program up, $10,000 to fly it. And really that's a filter to keep non-serious people away. $500 down payment, $10,000 will fly your payload. And he calls his wife and they say, yeah, this is great. We can't afford it, but you know what? We take a second mortgage out on the house. We can do it. It's okay. They agreed. And that's what they did. They took a second mortgage out when he got back to the States. Meantime, next day at the aerospace conference, Gil hunts down John Yardley and he gives him a check for $500. So I want to buy the first one. John says, what's this? So I want the first getaway special. John says, I can't take this check. And Gil says, John says, we just started. We don't even have an account where we can put the money. And Gil says, it'll be good. Hang on to the check. We're getting the rest of the money. So the first getaway special that flew carried payloads designed and built by high school and college students in Weber and Ogden, Utah. And this is how we wound up with a lot of kids getting their first real exposure to space with experiments flown as gas cans. A lot of, I think over 200 were flown. A lot of them were small experiments done by laboratories, by government agencies, et cetera. But a good portion of them were flown by kids and got them engaged in the space program. So, Gil, I feel we need to get him into the Hall of Fame. Most of the names that I would think of that we do have in there are not New Mexicans besides, Ed Mitchell and Jack Schmidt. There'd be a lot of the other names that I grew up with. So, Mary, if you could read me some of the names that you found, I could.
Oh, sure. Well, I'm going to say one because he went to St. Pius and so did I. And that is, let's see, astronaut Mike Mullane.
Mike, oh yeah, I met Mike. I worked with his daughter. I worked at space camp for a couple of years, and his daughter was one of our counselors. Terrific guy. Right.
Then you've got, of course, Clinton Anderson.
Mm-hmm. Senator Anderson helped make sure the shuttle happened.
Yes, exactly. Who else do we have here? William Douglas.
Not familiar with him.
Okay, he was born in Estancia. And of course, Robert Goddard is in there, who has a big connection with New Mexico.
Oh, I've got a cosmic connection to Goddard. He launched his first liquid propellant rocket on March 16, 1926. The same day my dad was born, about 80 miles away. Really? Yes.
In Massachusetts?
My dad was born in Somerville, and Goddard launched his rocket from Aunt Effie's cabbage patch about 80 miles away.
Wow. Yeah. And it's, they do call him the father of modern rocketry.
Yes, just
a lot of credit for it.
Yes, every rocket that flies, every modern rocket that flies is a Goddard rocket.
Okay. A real familiar name to those of us from Albuquerque is William H. Loveless.
Yes, Dr. Loveless offered up his clinic for the initial physiological screening on the men who became the Mercury 7 astronauts. My mother's cousin was married to a naval aviator who was offered a chance to go into the program, and at that point, Betty Wise, his wife, my mother's cousin, put her foot down and said, "No, I've put up enough with you being a pilot and night landings on carriers and everything, and this is where I draw the line." So he respected that. Okay, Lovelace Clinic did the testing because Lovelace already had a background in flight physiology, because high altitude, acceleration, et cetera, do some things to people, and unless you're really trained, or sometimes simply have the aptitude for it. One of the discussions you'll find if you dig into it is that when astronauts like Neil Armstrong and John Young fly, they don't just climb into an aircraft or a spacecraft, they put it on, they become part of it. And that's something unique that you want to find in training. And that's why NASA has leaned so heavily on pilots who have the test pilot background. The so-called Mercury 13 ladies went through similar physiological training at Lovelace. And one of the myths is that these ladies were in line to become Mercury astronauts, and then NASA turned them down. And no, that was not the case. NASA never got close to considering a cadre of women at that time, simply because, unfortunately, the way society was, they did not have the test pilot background. And the test pilot background was validated over and over again. For example, spacecraft tumbling out of control. That's exactly what happened to Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott on Gemini 8. And if Armstrong hadn't had that test pilot background, he would not have gotten the vehicle back under control. And a loss that early in the program could have been an end of the program. Gemini 6 is going to launch and rendezvous with Gemini 7, which is already in orbit. Wally Schirra is the command pilot on that one. Titan II rocket lights up. You feel it vibrating, and all of a sudden, everything shuts down. Wound up with a bit of debris, got stuck, and almost jammed up one of the turbines, so the thing shut down. And what Wally should have done by mission rules is he should have pulled the handle and ejected him and his pilot out of the spacecraft right then. But Wally thought, you know what? We're rocking back and forth, but I don't see any smoke or flame. We're not blowing up. So let's just wait and see what happens. And they were able to recycle and launch 2 days later. If he'd ejected, the spacecraft would have been destroyed on the pad. So that rendezvous mission would not have come off. And again, Neil landing on the moon and knowing that he's calculating mentally, yeah, I've got 30 seconds of fuel left, but you know what? That clear area just beyond the crater is only 15 or 20 seconds away, and we can do this. So yes, I'm glad that we have women in the program. They're good, they're capable, they bring a lot, just like any human being can. And I'm glad that those barriers have come down. In fact, I'm proud to say that we put the first woman on the moon. 2019, yeah, our summer camp 2019, we reenacted the first moonwalk, and the first kid that we put had come down the ladder and do with another kid and do this simulated moonwalk. It was Ariel Green, and the reason she got that spot is because she earned it. Her dad dropped her off early for camp a couple of days earlier, and rather than just have her sit and be bored, I said, would you like to help me prep some of the materials for the activities today? She said, sure. And she did a great job putting it together. I thought, okay, this young lady has the right stuff. She's going to be the first one on the moon.
Cool. Erin, do you have any other, anybody have questions?
Nope, don't see any.
Okay.
Where are we? Yep, just about out of time there.
Yeah, we're just right. This has been so interesting, and I can't thank you.
I'm glad you liked it. I'm glad to.
For joining.
Oh, we do have another question. Sorry.
Okay. I'm not seeing here. Go ahead. What's the
How
question?
often do astronauts bring back moon rocks?
Every time they go to the moon, which unfortunately has not been since 1972. We only landed on the moon 6 times, would have been 7, but Apollo 13 had the oxygen tank explosion. And you watch the movie, yeah, they get a number of things wrong, but you know what? They get more right than Hollywood usually gets wrong in a movie. And the key thing that they show is the spirit of teamwork. Everybody getting together. As Gene Kranz said, let's work the problem, people. And that's what they did. So 11, 12, then 14, 15, 16, 17, land on the moon. 11 was just there for a short stay. 17 was there on the surface for 3 days. So 3 times they went out and they drove that lunar rover 2-3 miles out. And the distance coming back, basically it was the walk back distance. So you drive the rover out, and then you want to start it up and come back, and you discover that the motor's gone dead, and AAA is not going to come up there. You've got enough oxygen and battery power to walk back. So that was the guiding principle. Never go out farther than you can afford to walk back. So question, any mascots taken up? So if you're talking about live animal mascots, 0, none. Now the shuttle Space Lab missions have carried live animal subjects, laboratory rats, and on Space Lab 3, 2 squirrel monkeys, and on other missions, fish, insects, etc. But a live mascot, no. Okay, little stuffed mascots, yes, those get taken up a lot. And it's part of the crew, usually part of the crew's personal preference kit. And if you saw the photograph of me earlier, I'm holding a rubber chicken next to me. That's Camilla. She's the mascot for a NASA solar physics mission. And when I was doing a presentation in Houston several years ago, she was there in my classroom. So I had her photobomb me. So each astronaut gets it's called a PPK, personal preference kit. And it's like 1 or 2 pounds, because weight is precious on spacecraft, 1 or 2 pounds of your personal stuff. that you can take. So astronauts might take his wife's engagement and wedding ring, or something from the kids, et cetera, say that this has been up in space. But those get screened because they didn't have guidelines on that initially. And the Apollo 15 crew took some stamps that they canceled when they were on the lunar surface and then sold them at auction when they got back. And basically all three of those astronauts got permanently grounded, effectively fired from NASA because of that. They didn't violate any law because there were no rules saying they couldn't do it. So things became very tight. So it's partly that crew safety issue. You don't want to take something, there go my heck hounds, crew safety issue. You don't want anything that might contaminate or be combustible. And there's a person at NASA, or is at WISTF rather, who is the official NASA nose. Anything that goes up, he sniffs, and he has some special samples that he'll sniff before going to work to make sure that his nose is in working order, because you don't want things off-gassing and causing a really obnoxious odor that puts the crew on edge or even causes an allergic reaction. My boss said that one of his my boss is a retired naval officer. One of his classmates is an astronaut. And he asked his buddy after his first mission, what was it like opening the hatch between the shuttle and space station and going on board? And he said, it was just like going on board a submarine that comes back from a 6-month deployment. So Chris says the myth in the movies is sailor comes home from deployment and the wife is, oh, honey, I missed you so much. No, the wife goes, here, you go take a shower. I'm going to go burn your clothes. Because you've been soaking in all these odors from your crewmates and the ship. He said the only thing that was missing on space station were the machine oil smells that you get. But in the meantime, it's you and a couple of hundred people crammed inside this metal can for months, and your body absorbs it, your skin absorbs it. So you don't want to carry anything up there that's going to make that worse.
Well, thank you again. We really appreciate.
My pleasure.
And we do have a couple more talks coming up. We have Thursday, October 7th, a tour of Spaceport America. And Thursday, October 21st, we have Mike Shinneberry, who is going to be talking about the Trinity site. So go ahead and register for those Zoom links. The links are on the website and on Facebook. And we hope to see you soon. So thank you everybody for joining us. Bye.